Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Healthy Landscapes Program Webinar Wednesday, hosted by FRI Research. My name is David Anderson, and I'm the program lead for the Healthy Landscapes Program and responsible ultimately for this project and many others. Today, we have the pleasure of hearing Dr. Rick Bonars present his findings on a project that we've called EBM Challenges for Alberta and Saskatchewan Forests. Rick spent the last couple of years reading papers, plans, policy documents, and conducting a series of expert interviews. And he's compiled a long list of challenges to the implementation of EBM. And he's got some recommendations for how to address them. Today, he's going to share an overview of those findings. Please note that due to a scheduling conflict, we've recorded this presentation. After it's over, we'll have some instructions on how you can join a live Q&A session. So with that, take it away, Rick.
Hello and welcome to this special Healthy Landscapes Program webinar. I'm very pleased to have you with us today. We are going to have a presentation from Rick Bonar, who's going to be talking about EBM challenges. And without further ado, I am going to pass the reins over to Rick. I will just note that there will be an opportunity for a couple of questions and answers at the end of the broadcast. And for those who are watching this as a recorded broadcast, you can ask questions by using the chat box on your control panel, and they will be addressed. So thanks very much for attending, and I'm going to pass it over to Rick.
Thanks, Terry, and welcome everyone. I'm going to be talking to you today about a project that I completed for the Healthy Landscapes program entitled EBM Challenges in Alberta and Saskatchewan Forests. This was a 2-year project and it's wrapped up now, and this is an overview webinar, and hopefully there will be follow-up presentations that get into a little bit more of the details of the project. So by way of introduction, what the project was looking at doing was improving understanding of where EBM, ecosystem-based management implementation, is at for the forested landscapes of both Alberta and Saskatchewan, looking at the challenges that are out there and the opportunities to further EBM. It was really a big project, and we're only going to look at the higher level summary report items in today's webinar. There's just too much detail for the whole project to get it into it in one presentation. I recommend that you look on the FRI website and look at the main report sections, which delve into each topic in considerably more detail. And I'm also hopeful that this project will serve as a foundation for future initiatives related to EBM in the 2 provinces. So we had some objectives for the project, and the first one, of course, is what the heck is EBM? And this is actually quite a major challenge. There's quite a lot of difference of opinion there. And having defined it in some way, not necessarily the only way, where are we at today in the 2 provinces, and what are the challenges and opportunities around the opportunities to do more? The methods were fairly straightforward. I reviewed the forest management scene in both Alberta and Saskatchewan, focusing on 3 land use types listed here: commercial forests, which have some form of forest industry tenure, federal and provincial protected areas, and then the large non-commercial forests in the northern parts of both provinces that have very little human presence and not a lot of industrial activity. The documents reviewed included legislation, policies, and plans from the governments, but also from industry and other organizations. Some published literature related to EBM elements and themes, and then a series of 19 interviews with EBM experts. These were anonymous interviews. They were 1.5 hours long for each, and it was to get additional insight that wasn't necessarily obvious from the published literature or other available online documentation. So the first thing that comes up is EBM is a big idea. EBM is really about forest management writ large. It's very comprehensive, it's very complex, and it can be overwhelming and even intimidating. If you imagine it as an analogy of trying to juggle all balls at once, and you've got more balls than you can possibly keep in the air at once. Of course, that makes it very difficult to understand, and like most people would tend to recoil from the complexity and the size of that and default back to individual things that they're interested in or value. The EBM wheel shown on the right of this slide is a construct developed by the Healthy Landscapes program to make a start at describing EBM in more bite-sized pieces, but it's of course more complicated than it can be even described in the wheel here. One way to start is to look at the goals of EBM. There really are two goals. One is related to ecological integrity, and the second is to human well-being. And I like to use the analogy of the goose that laid the golden age to represent these two thoughts. Really, ecological integrity in the forest, all of the processes that are operating there is the goose. We need to keep the goose healthy and have integrity so that it will keep laying the golden age eggs that support human well-being. Another way of looking at that is to look at the web of concepts that humans value that are part of the concept of ecological integrity, and many of those are listed here, but of course there's others. And the same with human well-being. All of the things that flow from forest ecosystems that humans need and value. So what did I find about what is EBM? Well, there's a widespread lack of knowledge about what EBM is. It's almost a in thing among insiders who know about EBM, and everybody else glazes over pretty quickly when you say EBM and they don't really understand what it means. Even among those who are familiar with EBM, when you ask them about the details, it means different things to different people. And this leads to a challenge in that EBM is being used to promote agendas. So if people are interested in a particular aspect of forest management, they like to promote EBM to promote what they think should be done about that particular aspect. And somebody else might have a different idea about what it means, and therefore you really haven't come to a common understanding. You're just using EBM for different purposes. Having said that, though, it's pretty clear that EBM is supported in principle by most people who understand it or have some degree of involvement with it. And even those that have a brief explanation usually say, yeah, I think that's a good way to go. However, given what I said above, support is conditional. So it still depends on what the details are. And that's always the problem with most human enterprises. You have to get into the details before people can fully get on board. EBM is really a mutable thing. It's a balance. Because it's a human construct, it's in fact what people say it is. So it has to be defined in space and in time. And it's concerned with managing across a gradient of human uses from a very light human touch to a heavy hand. So if you can imagine, perhaps a protected area would have a light human touch, although some of those in fact have a very heavy human touch, and a very altered landscape such as a community or a mining site would be at the other end of the spectrum. However, EBM applies across all of these. It's just that the balance between ecological integrity and human well-being shifts depending on those decisions that have been made for land use. Which brings us to another major challenge. The way we govern forests right now is very fractured. We have it divided by human uses and their regulatory regimes and clients. We have the values and pieces that these regimes and clients are concerned about managed separately. We have very busy landscapes with lots of uses and considerations that we really don't do the best job of integrating all on one place over time. So our basic system is whenever there's an economic or a social use that's deemed to be important, we establish institutions that are assigned to manage and govern those. And usually what they do is they try to maximize that particular value. And then those values are brought in as rules that govern other things. And so what we do is we try and manage our activities to maximize outputs, but we really don't pay as much attention to the outcomes that we should. And of course, when we have new knowledge, we have new pressures, new societal norms, we just add those to the same basic system by adding more rules to those already in place. An example of that might be the species at risk legislation, which is comparatively new in Canada, only about 15 or 16 years old. Species at risk legislation was brought in to address problems with species viability and conservation. And there is a legislation at the federal level and complementary actions at provincial levels that are intended to protect species at risk and recover them. And most of that is done through constraints on all of those other activities previously mentioned. So there's a problem with this, is that it ignores the variable nature of the natural system it's intended to serve, and it limits our options. If you have to follow rules, then the decision space you have to operate in is reduced. If you have to achieve outcomes that you've collectively defined, you have more opportunity for innovation. The other part of this is that governments have difficulty envisioning and implementing long-term programs. There's usually regular turnover of leadership in the senior public service, and the flavor of the day and the pressures of the day tend to dominate conversations and actions. So what happens is that often really big picture long-term risks and issues are avoided. We tend to maintain the status quo, and that erodes our efforts to coordinate and integrate and manage for and within natural ecosystem dynamics. There's a ray of hope, though. Both provinces have incorporated some EBM elements into their planning standards. Saskatchewan is actually now beginning to implement EBM for their provincial protected areas. Overall, EBM goals of ecological integrity and human well-being are widely accepted. They're incorporated into high-level policy in both provinces and at the federal level as well. So everybody has endorsed at high levels EBM. The problem then is taking it from agreement that this is a good direction to go, and actually bringing it to management in the forest over time. One of the key issues to overcome is the concepts of protection versus exploitation, which you often see in framing discussions about forests. It's really posed as it's an either or thing. It's really not, of course. There are no such things as fully protected ecosystems that are free from human influence. Even in the remotest protected areas, there are still human influences, whether that be through climate change or non-native species or other factors that affect those areas. And of course, at the other end, we have very highly altered and exploited landscapes. But the argument for EBM is that we can have landscapes with varying degrees of protection and exploitation that all, each in their own way, contribute to ecological integrity and human well-being. So really, there's opportunities at two levels here. We can inform land use decisions about the relative proportions of forests to be in the different categories. And of course, it's sometimes very different and difficult to challenge and change land use designations. But really, if that's going to be done, it has to be led by governments, and land use plans and legislation are the place to do it. The other thing is once decisions have been made, let's say we've decided this is going to be a protected area or that's going to be a commercial forest, then we can use EBM to inform the decisions how to achieve the best balance between EI and HW, considering that land use designation. So, okay, a protected area isn't going to have forest harvesting in it, but what else is going to happen and how will that be managed versus a commercial forest where there is going to be forest harvesting? but perhaps there's another way of getting at that and approximating natural dynamics. So each area is different, and each area will attract a different version of EBM depending on its natural values and the values of the people who use it. Which brings me to EBM value propositions. One of the things I heard consistently is that people glaze over when they see some of the high-level elements and concepts of EBM, and they want to talk about things that they value and that are important to them. And so what we need are more statements and arguments about, you know, this is the way things are done right now. Perhaps we could do it this way, and that would be more consistent with the way EBM would suggest we do it. And then we can compare and contrast that way of doing it with the current way of doing it in terms that people are interested in, and then discuss which alternative might be better. So for example, instead of talking about representation of all ecosystems, we might say, have a conversation about old growth. And we might say, well, what's happening with old growth and where are things headed right now, the way we're doing things, and how would EBM approach the question of conservation of old growth? And then compare and contrast. And I got the impression from folks that said, you know, I'm not really concerned about these big picture things. I'm really just interested in this. If conversations were promoted to them about the things that they're concerned about, they'd be more likely to understand and get on board with EBM. The other aspect that came forth as a major challenge was the affordability of EBM and the fear of the unknown, if nothing else. It must be affordable, it must be realistic, but unfortunately what's happening right now in large part is as EBM elements are being brought in incrementally and gradually, the costs associated with bringing those elements in is being added to the pile of costs that are already there. They aren't being matched by elimination of costs that are no longer needed or reallocation of those to more productive EBM costs. So the opportunity, of course, is to improve the outcomes through EBM, reduce the risks, improve the outcomes, and reduce the costs, or at least keep them the same through reallocation and integration. And again, value propositions are a potential way of having those conversations and trying to get support for EBM through economics. A particular part that's applicable to commercial forests is the economic wood supply. So the existing industry infrastructure and their demands for affordable wood that meets their quality specifications at a delivered cost that they can afford to pay and still turn into a profit at the end of the day. And concerns about whether or not EBM would have impacts on that. And if people can easily envision that some aspects of EBM would in fact have impacts on existing AAC and industry viability, but there could also be positive effects on quantity and cost. Unfortunately, we haven't answered that question yet because we don't really have forest management plans where full EBM principles have been applied so that you could actually compare and contrast before and after costs. So one of the opportunities is to explore packages that really look at, you know, if we had a negative for a cost for wood supply on this side of the ledger, could we have something else that might balance it on the other side? And this is where there are opportunities for innovation and creative thinking that transcend the existing administrative systems. So for example, if you're going to have more old forest on a commercial landscape, that might reduce AAC, but perhaps you could replace that AAC with wood from somewhere else. There are ways of addressing the problem. One of the things that earlier initiatives through the Healthy Landscapes program found was that trust is a tremendous challenge to EBM. In fact, trust is a tremendous challenge to any human initiative. And we've got now in the two provinces conflicts that generate mistrust. And those conflicts are intensifying because there are more pressures on natural resources. There are more demands for greater input and accountability. And this isn't new. If you look at the published literature, societal levels of trust have been declining for many decades. And it's getting to the point that few people trust information about forests that they get regardless of the source. So that really is a barrier. If people are not trusting, then they're very unlikely to partner and explore opportunities for improvements through EBM. This also means that there's minimal space for involvement. That creates perceptions of a closed policy process dominated by industry and or government, and it marginalizes others, such as local communities, Indigenous folks, people that don't have a voice or who have a voice, but it's not very powerful. These people have to have a say, and a way to build trust is to bring them in, listen to them, respect their opinions, and provide them feedback as to why or why not their opinions and thoughts are going to be actioned or not. And really what we need to do there is expand the policy networks and have more people brought into the conversation so that EBM can be broadened to include more perspectives and hopefully be inclusive of those and come up with the best balance that most meets the collective values of society. Of course, one way to build trust is to build partnerships. And because EBM is striving to include and reconcile all of these aspects for whole landscapes, partnerships and involvement among people and organizations is a huge opportunity. Right now, though, we've got our governance system, which divides those values and their respective management systems into silos. So really need to find a way to break down the silos and get people to skip outside and step outside their areas of focus and responsibility and work with others who have interests over common aspects to try and resolve and integrate and partner to come up with something that's better. Everybody doing their own thing in isolation is not going to help. We need partnerships and integration. Another thing I heard was that EBM is too uncertain, too risk, too new. There's going to be pushback about implementing something new simply because people are unfamiliar with it, or they have fear of the unknown, or they haven't really thought about what's happening now in terms of the risks associated with the status quo. And it's really important that we have to recognize these fears and the uncertainty and find ways of comparing and contrasting risk and uncertainty of the status quo with possible better futures through EBM. It's human nature not to want to make changes because of the potential risks of those, but we often are in our back of our mind comparing it with the status quo and assuming that the status quo is fine. If we just continue on the status quo, everything will be good. Well, it's becoming very apparent that many of the large risks of the status quo are not being adequately addressed, and they are going to cause outages and problems if they're not successfully addressed. So there's a lot of talk now about resilience and adaptation in the face of climate change, and that risk is not being well addressed by the status quo. We have the risks of large natural disturbances such as forest fires and floods that are always going to be risks, but there may be ways of using EBM to reduce the impacts of those and or mitigate the outcomes. And again, what we need to do is compare the risks of the current approach with potential EBM improvements, and then promote conversations between the two. One thing that also came out was that because EBM is such a large concept and it is an education thing and a knowledge thing, that champions are really key to getting something new up and running and accepted. It's much more difficult to implement something new if nobody seems to be a leader or a champion that's out there waving the flag and providing leadership to help get things off the ground and running. We already have quite a few EBM champions out there, but often those people are there because of their particular job description and or their particular interests. They're not necessarily there because they've been assigned the job of being an EBM champion. However, we can build on them and recognize them and provide support for their interest, and perhaps organizations can actually assign resources towards EBM and therefore build more capacity for champions and help to build support for implementing EBM. And there are really opportunities there, perhaps efforts to improve participation of Indigenous people in resource management. I found that many of the Indigenous belief systems were very consistent with and compatible with EBM. So people are already thinking in those terms. They may not call it the same things. We need more leaders, more support, and more engagement from people that are already opinion leaders and decision maker leaders, and they're people that have voices that people already trust or can grow to trust. Now to a key aspect of EBM is adopting an NRV, natural range of variation strategy. This comes from the recognition that all forests are changing over time within measurable and predictable ranges, and EBM theory suggests that one way of maintaining ecological aspects for their integrity is to keep them within or closer to NRV over time. So if we have a certain age class structure of forest stands and we get too far out on the limb away from that either at the older end or at the younger end, risks increase. And so if we are closer to or within NRV, risks are going to be lower. What we have is some implementation of the NRV strategy concept, most familiarity, can't get that word out, at the commercial forest level. So NRV is routinely incorporated into forest management planning nowadays, but you don't see it elsewhere where it might be applicable. You don't see it very much, for example, in protected areas planning. You don't see it in aquatic ecosystems planning. You don't see it in wildlife species and species at risk planning. It's just not there. There are roles and opportunities for NRV there, but we haven't got there yet. Another problem is people sometimes question the applicability of NRV given how much humans have already impacted and altered natural landscapes. So we've got very busy landscapes, and people say, well, you can't use NRV here, so why even bother with it? And I think the answer there is that even if you can't use all parts of NRV, you can use NRV to inform your decisions about what to do, and perhaps when that activity is done, how to go about restoring to more natural systems. Also, we get people that think NRV is great, but they balk when it translates into change in their backyard, the NIMBY effect, the not in my backyard effect. This was brought forth. So for example, people say, yeah, we should have forest harvesting events that are larger so that we approximate some of the larger forest fires. And that's all very well and good to say in principle, but when you come into the backyard of a trapper or a cottage owner or somebody who traditionally has used an area and say, we want to do a really large disturbance event in your backyard here, they tend to say, that's a good idea, but can you go do it somewhere else? And then finally, and this is particularly prevalent among government, is the NRV elements they like and they support and they oppose those that they don't. So cherry picking is as Dave Anderson calls it. So really, if you're going to adopt an NRV strategy, you need to look at NRV from all aspects and then make decisions with your eyes open. Having said that, it makes sense to do it as an EBM foundation. There are a lot of opportunities to explore differences in interpretation, identify the uncertainties, and we can understand better NRV through research and communications. Use NRV in situations where it might be applicable that we aren't using it now. So for example, when we talk about floods, we don't normally talk about NRV in specific terms, although you do hear considerable mention about flood return intervals expressed as maybe 1 in 100 year floods and things like this. Well, a 1 in 100 year flood is actually a representation of the upper end of an NRV distribution. And years where there are no floods are at the lower end, and in between are various combinations of floods and not floods. So the flow regime within watersheds and water bodies is actually under an NRV distribution. If we could somehow get people talking in those terms so that you expect that those floods that come along every now and then are actually going to occur, and manage accordingly, expecting that at some point they will occur, and that their occurrence actually has both negative and positive impacts on the ecological side as well on the human side, then we might be able to do a better job of managing them instead of reacting when they occur. And I guess a good example of that right now is what's just happened in interior BC after those major storms last month. The other aspect of NRV is understanding and integrating disturbance. Because the forests are going to be subject to disturbance and therefore changing as a response to having had a disturbance and then recovering from disturbance. And in Alberta and Saskatchewan, the dominant natural disturbance is fire. There's a significant challenge around having that conversation with society and getting them to agree that disturbance is necessary, disturbance is valuable, and that we have to learn to live with disturbance and in fact manage for disturbance over the long term in order to maintain ecological integrity. Right now, you have significant numbers of folks that think that disturbance is to be avoided. We shouldn't actually be having logging. We should be putting out fires. We should try and avoid floods. We should do anything we can do to not have disturbance. But of course, if we were successful in doing that, then our forests would become outside of natural range of variation, and then there would be ecological risks as well as those to human well-being. Fire is the dominant disturbance, as I said, and boreal species need this periodic fire to maintain long-term viability. There are species that are very adapted to exploit conditions immediately after fires, and others that are adapted to exploit conditions that develop many decades, potentially even centuries after a fire. Each of these groups has to have a cycling amount of the conditions they need in order to persist over the long term. On the other hand, we know that fires can be really destructive to human values, including life, health, and property. The Richardson Fire, the Horse River Fire, the Great Fire of 1919 are examples of past catastrophic level fires that caused tremendous problems to human well-being. And we know these are going to happen occasionally. It's very difficult right now to get off the vortex of trying to put out fires because of the risk that one will get away and turn into one of these catastrophic events. And we've got also increasing societal views that fires are to be avoided. We've got people concerned about the health effects of smoke. We've got people thinking that forests should be protected so that they can store more carbon, battle climate change. On the other hand, we've got the ecological perspective that fire is a part of the natural system and is necessary to maintain its integrity. So the challenge is there. How do we change conversations from issues about fire as a threat to issues about fire as a tool and a necessity and opportunities to maintain fire as an ecological process, hopefully to both maintain ecological integrity and reduce risk to human well-being. And floods, I just threw a few pictures up here. It's the same issue. Floods can be very destructive. You see in the upper left here. On the other hand, you see a long history of floods and hydrological action that creates a rich mosaic of riparian habitats. And you see a flood in action that's actually recruited and moved wood, forming a log jam. And these log jams become ecologically important for aquatic habitat over time. So floods destroy, but floods also create. Carrying along that theme of variation, we've also got an issue with not only desiring variation in nature, but adjusting our management system so that we get more variation in our management system. What we have now is general legislation policies, other instruments and requirements. They tend to simplify them and make them specific and often inflexible. So we build rules. We say, okay, you have to do this, and that takes away from the variation that we might like to promote. And when we do bring in variation in our targets, we have difficulty expressing or changing a rule from a do this, like leave a 30-meter buffer on a creek, for example, to maintain ecological function in riparian areas. How do you measure that? How do you make that a target? How do you make that an objective? How do you implement that? It's difficult, and we need to find ways to start doing that. One of the things to build on with respect to that is that Alberta and Saskatchewan already have a relatively flexible framework on variability, which provides an opportunity. They provide, for example, opportunities for forest companies to propose alternatives to minimum government standards in their forest management planning standards and their operating rules. And over time, some of those proposals have been accepted, and that introduces variation into the system. More use of variance alternatives and approval of experiments and variations that help to bring in variation would be helpful. Any management system is dependent on knowledge and information. And many of the information needs to support EBM are relatively new. And we've got the current knowledge system disconnected and divided. And sometimes it's geographically sporadic and incomplete. Some areas we have better knowledge than others. We have opportunities there. Of course, we can have cooperative agreements among data owners to make their information accessible. We have tremendous advances in technologies such as LiDAR and GIS, which can be exploited to provide the knowledge needed to plan and implement EBM. And we have a lot of research, particularly in Alberta, but also in Saskatchewan, and certainly Saskatchewan joining in with some of the initiatives in Alberta, such as the Healthy Landscapes program. So we have lots of good institutions and initiatives that are useful and building knowledge and information. I listed a few here: the Alberta Biodiversity Monitoring Institute, Canadian Oil Sands Innovation Alliance, the EMAN, FRI research. These are good initiatives to build on and leverage for knowledge and research. And also to pay for it, we've got models such as the Alberta Forest Resource Improvement Program, which provides funding through the forest sector for research and knowledge generation. Monitoring is, of course, important to see whether or not we're being successful, and that means that targets for outcomes have to be set, and then both the actions intended to achieve the outcomes and the actual outcomes themselves have to be measured to see whether or not there's success. So you need to know whether the actions produce the outcomes, and you need to know whether you actually applied the actions. Where we are at now is we often default to activities rather than outcomes. So we'll have an activity that we require or impose, and we have an outcome that is presumed or not measured. So for example, riparian management, if we apply the buffers required in commercial forests and that's done successfully, we assume that riparian ecosystem health will be achieved, but we don't actually measure whether riparian ecosystem health has been achieved. We just measure whether or not we applied the ground rule buffers. The current standard for comparing predictions to outcomes is adaptive management, but when I asked about adaptive management, everybody agreed with it in principle, and you do see a lot of reference to applying adaptive management, but there's a lot more service towards saying we're going to do adaptive management and not as much actual implementation of it. And part of that is it's assumed to be daunting, expensive, and risky by both government and industry. Risky in that you're trying something that you don't know will work, expensive in that you're going to have to monitor it, daunting in that you have to design it and then do it and monitor it. So that requires quite a bit of organizational change, trust, and partnerships. And there are opportunities related to those, again, mentioning some of the things I said on the previous page. And I think really where an opportunity for adaptive management and monitoring should be through cooperative EBM planning, which is covered a little bit further on here. The legislation and policy frameworks are a mosaic that was developed over a long period of time, sometimes and often in isolation from each other. And it tends to be a big pile of confusing stuff that doesn't really provide clear or integrated direction to managers in many cases. Having said that, they weren't developed with EBM in mind, but there's lots of things in there that are compatible with EBM principles. And many of those legal instruments have variance clauses, as I mentioned previously. These allow alternative proposals that may be used only with special review and approval. And if they were used more often, they are a way to trial and demonstrate and test new EBM opportunities without changing the underlying legislation and policy framework. And if they prove to be successful, then eventually the legislation and policy can be amended to catch up. So this is a way of trying new things without making a wholesale commitment that we've decided that what we have is inadequate and this new approach is going to work. We can trial and learn by doing. So how do we overcome silos? How do we overcome disjointed governance? The planning opportunity is huge. If we can't have people having coordinated and accommodating legislation, maybe we can get all of the people with their different pieces coming together and working on land use plans at a couple of scales, as I'll mention here. The first is provincial land use plans. So this is where governments make decisions about what human uses will be allowed and what ecosystems are important and need to be treated differently than others. Both of the provinces have land use planning processes and decisions. Unfortunately, they have not embraced EBM as their land use planning foundation paradigm, and they haven't incorporated an implementation framework into their decisions and planning processes. That isn't a huge barrier to overcome. It's just a matter of them deciding that they're going to do it. I think the first thing there that would be useful would be a discussion and concept paper comparing how land use planning is done now with what it might be done like if more attention to EBM was brought into the processes. Again, as I said earlier, once you've made the land use decision, then you've got to decide how to do EBM for landscapes. So if once you've got an area decided and say that's a protected area, then you have to determine what the mix between ecological integrity and human well-being will be for that area. They're both linked to time and place. So a landscape scale or a sub-regional plan that actually develops indicators and sets quantitative targets for all ecosystems and human uses within a landscape is the EBM ideal. There are lots of plans out there already that are steps along the path toward that ideal. There are plans for protected areas, there are forest management plans, there are other sub-regional plans, but my examination of them showed that they all kind of fall short from an EBM perspective. They either don't look at the long term, they're not quantitative, they only look at some aspects. There's various challenges that need to be addressed to really be comprehensive EBM landscape plans. The biggest challenge to doing this is overcoming the status quo and resistance from established arrangements that hinder policy reforms. We need more partnerships, we need more collaborations and more pilots that would help to trial out these EBM landscape plans. So we're not starting from scratch. We already have managers in many cases that prepare area-based management plans that could be transitioned. It would be better if they were directed by higher level policies and land use plans, but if they're not there, they can be imagined. And it would really be useful to have concept papers that look at what one of these landscape plans might be like, what the terms of reference might look like, how people would be involved, etc. And we could pilot a couple of these in concert with regular and scheduled updates for existing plans, such as forest management plans or park management plans. Piggyback on those to reduce costs and trial out some of these new things. And there's big opportunity, I think, to bring in the Indigenous side with some of these EBM landscape plans. And in my review of the literature, I found that there are a lot of Indigenous organizations that are already on the path of EBM. The diagram on the right here is from a First Nations band in BC, but if you look at what they say as an ecosystem-based conservation plan, much of it is very consistent with EBM. One of the other problems we have with planning is we plan for administrative units. So a park, a protected area, a forest management tenure. We don't tend to plan on ecological contexts. So the obvious way to overcome this is to incorporate both. So if you're doing a plan for, let's say, a forest management area shown in the green square on the left side, and you have overlapping species distribution shown in the red shapes, and watersheds shown in the blue shapes, and natural regions shown in the green shapes, and you put them all together, then the outer surface of that figure becomes the ecological context. And you can plan your piece within the square, and you can talk to your neighbors about what's going on in the other squares. And Alberta actually made a start on this already with the regional plans under the land use framework. On the right is a chart that shows one of the sub-regional plans and a landscape assessment that the Alberta government commissioned. And you can see in the lower right there an ecological context, in which case it's the natural subregions within that plan area. So you can look at, say, the upper foothills, and you can say, well, what's the distribution of forest age classes in the upper foothills? And then provide direction down to how somebody who has a portion of the upper foothills in their administrative area can contribute to what's going on in the upper foothills as a whole. Now towards the three different categories, some of the thoughts that came from analysis of them. Start with commercial forest planning. What we're doing in commercial forests today is we're trying to maximize sustainable timber harvest to supply processing mills, subject to constraints for other resources and values. This creates a planning process where we divide the land base into two categories: the active land base, which is going to be logged at some point, and the passive, which will never be logged. And in Alberta, that adds up to about half and half over the whole province, and similar in Saskatchewan. So it means that the forest managers are actually planning disturbance on half the land base and ignoring the other half. But we don't actually ignore the other half. We do other things like energy sector development, and we protect it from fire, and we do other things. So what we have right now is a process where we really aren't applying EBM to whole landscapes. We're applying EBM to bits and pieces. It isn't that difficult to imagine that we could look at whole landscapes if we wanted to, but it would mean that we should get voices that represent those other parts of the landscapes and other human uses involved with planning for forest management plans. There's a couple ways I can see to do that. You can revise the FMP process to make it more inclusive and comprehensive, or you could replace it with sub-regional EBM planning that's led by governments. And perhaps a good way to get your feet wet would be some kind of a concept discussion paper that compares the two alternatives. I mentioned pilots earlier. I think support for pilots and trying pilots would be a huge opportunity that costs little and could provide a lot of benefit and learning that could then be exported and expanded in application. It's not just at the forest management plan level where we can do pilots. I listed below in blue a number of examples where pilots could be done that would be very useful and contributing towards EBM implementation. Just as an example, access management plans. The diagram on this slide is from the Little Smoky area in Alberta, and it represents a pilot project done between the Foothills Landscape Management Forum and the Government of Alberta. On the left is all of the existing roads in that area, and on the right is a plan for a future road network that is 42% less, because all of the companies operating in that area from both the energy and forest sectors got together and said, you know, can we reduce roading here? What do we need to have? And what other things that are out there that we don't need over the long run that can go away over the long run? So you can see some of the benefits. There's ecological benefits to reducing the road network by 42%, but there's also human well-being benefits. 42% roads means 42% less cost to build, maintain, and eventually reclaim roads. So if we were to do it in a greenfield situation where there were no existing roads and did this sort of a process, we would come up with a better outcome at the start rather than going back and fixing it later as we did in this example. In protected areas, we've got those administered by Parks Canada and those administered by the provinces, provincial parks. Many of the national parks are now managed according to EBM principles, most notably including a system of ecological integrity indicators, which are many of them EBM friendly. However, the national parks don't use natural range of variation in their management plans, and many of their management plans are now trending towards shorter and less detailed plans than they used to be. And they don't look at those indicators over the long term. When you get to the provincial scene, you have similar kinds of things that also in many areas, you have provincial protected areas that are supposed to have management plans, done every 5 years or 10 years or some other cycle. And many of them have been in place for a very long time and have not yet gotten a management plan. And this is simply because they don't have the resources to build these management plans. NRV is not being used widely to inform management planning in protected areas. In many areas, especially those that have high levels of human use, wildfire suppression is really common. And if we suppress wildfires and don't have other disturbance, then we're starting to adjust that natural range of ecosystem conditions outside what normally would have occurred in the past. That's not saying that's applicable to all areas. For example, Wood Buffalo National Park, the wildfire policy up there is largely, not suppression oriented. And in the southern parts, national parks, they're actually trying to apply prescribed fires, but they've been unable to burn at rates that match historic rates of natural wildfire and indigenous burning, which is mixed up with the natural system. So protected area managers do, though, have the advantage of management control over most of the ecosystems and human uses, and they can use this built-in authority to develop and implement EBM plans. And again, an initial opportunity to review what they do now and processes and identify opportunities for improvement. Non-commercial forests are another big category. We've got these large areas in the north of the provinces that don't have many people, don't have much industrial activity, don't have much access. A lot of cases, their fire regimes are relatively intact because it's just too remote and not enough people and human values and not affordable to try and suppress fires in those areas. And really, they're kind of in limbo. And there are opportunities, I think, to implement EBM in these places. And I think that should be led by the people who live there, the indigenous peoples, in partnership with the provincial governments and others that have interests. I think this is very consistent with what indigenous peoples seem to be asking for. And it's really an opportunity that needs to be led by those folks. So I'm going to conclude here with two sort of summary slides that just kind of list a few of the things that I found and some potential things that could be done to help address them. There are hundreds of them in the detailed report. I'll just let you read these on your own. I won't spend a lot of time going over any individual ones, but just suffice it to say that there's lots like that, and there are lots of opportunities to change things for the better through EBM. And this is the last slide.
Thanks for that, Rick. Much appreciated. For those of you interested, the details of Rick's findings can be found on the project site on the FRI website on the link shown here. And that link should also be available in your chat box.